Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to talk about my first roll of Lucky Color 200, another brand new color negative film slowly hitting the global market, which I shot in the new to me Leica M4-2. Let's get into it. When I placed a large order for film and a bunch of other things from Reflx Lab a while ago, they asked me if I'd be interested in trying out a roll of Lucky Color 200, and we have collaborated on various things in the past, but I'm still very grateful to Reflx Lab for that opportunity, and they are an official distributor of Lucky products, so I presume they'll be one of the places you'll be able to get this internationally once the global launch happens. Speaking of that, this is a pre-production roll from the first large-scale pre-production test batch, so there are some differences that aren't going to be reflective of the final product. The two main things being the blue dots, an emulsion defect peppered over many of the frames, which will be sorted out by the time they get to large, full-scale coding, and also that the rebate reads 200T. This isn't a 200 speed tungsten balanced film, that just indicates that it's from a test batch. Luckyfilm, based in the Hebei province of China, were one of the largest film manufacturers back in the golden heyday of film. And I admit this is before my time, but it was often said that Kodak leans yellow and orange, Fuji leans cyan and green, and Lucky leans strong into reds, if that gives you any sense of the scale of the operations that they're working in. They have kind of had a resurgence back into the film manufacturing space though in the last couple of years with a number of black and white film stocks. I recently spoke about their new SHD 100 black and white panchromatic negative film, and in the past I spoke about a very expired roll of Lucky Super 100, but they seem to be really getting back into the swing of it, which is a great thing to see. Lucky have also collaborated with Kodak on various other projects in the past, so I'm sure there was some cross-pollination of technology there. Having been teased for quite a while and featured on sites like Cosmophoto or the Reflx Lab blog, Lucky Color 200 has been sort of soft launched, like I said, which some people suspect is a way to test market response before they go all in with full-scale manufacturing. Last I heard on the record, Lucky Film are still only producing about 300 rolls a day, which is absolutely nothing and makes it quite hard to get even in their home country of China. I don't speak any Chinese language or any Asian language, to be frank, but through various middlemen and other people who've communicated with me, I gather that the overall social media response to Lucky Color 200 in China has been very positive, though with some polarized opinions that will probably become a bit more obvious as we really get into this. The film was previously showcased on Red Note with a sample image featuring the project's chief engineer, and it showed low saturation, relatively modest contrast, and a cool cyan overall tint with some magenta thrown in. It showed good response to blues with an amazing response to reds in the color chart, but with quite weaker greens. That is a backlit photo taken under very non-ideal conditions though, and later images taken under much warmer direct sunlight showed vastly better color reproduction, though that source said it took them about 10 minutes to get the look right. And based on my own experiences, that latter shot, that warmer golden look, is more down to post-processing than the natural tendencies of the film itself. Yeah, you can make every film look like anything, but I want to showcase how the film tends to lean, kind of without any major adjustments. Also known as Lucky C200, this is a daylight balanced color negative film with a box speed of 200, and it will be available in the 35mm format for sure for the global launch, and I suspect it will come in 120 later, but that has not been confirmed as of now. All of the Lucky black and white films are available in 120 as well. It's just that 35mm makes up like some ridiculous statistic like 94% of the global market. So it would make sense for them to stick with 35mm and come out with 120 at a later date, but I would still like for it to come out in 120 as well as bulk rolls and the like, even if that's not as likely. The 35mm rolls are packaged into metal canisters containing 36 exposures each, and they do bear a proper DX code to communicate the frame count and the ISO to your camera. The emulsion is coated onto an acetate base, and it does have both an anti-halation layer and a Hansen type mask for contrast and color control. The emulsion is said to employ a high silver content that's intended to offer superior saturation and tonal depth. What's inarguably true and much more impressive is the 14-layer construction of this film. 14 layers is absolutely crazy for a company to come out with their first generation of like a new line of product. Lucky never really died, but they did kind of get out of this market for quite a long time, so to come right back in with a 14-layer film is absolute insanity. If we take Tri-X as an example of a regular black and white film, You have the standard acetate base, then you have a low-speed emulsion layer, a high-speed emulsion layer, and an overcoat on top. That's just 3 layers though. I mean, a modern color negative film is way more advanced, with typically 13 to 17 emulsion layers. Multiple emulsion layers per dye coupler, per color, interlayers and filter layers between them, an anti-halation layer of Renjet or Kerry silver, overcoats, possibly a UV filtration layer, and more. I believe Vision 3500T has 13 or 14 layers, Portra 160 has 14 layers to it, and one of the Velvia films I remember reading years ago, and I can't remember where, has something like 21 layers to it. The engineering challenges and complexity, as well as quality control difficulties in manufacturing and maintaining quality of such a complicated thin film coating operation, increases exponentially, requiring highly specialized equipment that you don't just magic up out of nowhere. So how did Lucky pull this off? Well, they've never actually left the thin film coating industry, even if they aren't making consumer grade color film anymore, at least up until now. They've still been producing photographic paper and X-ray film, and industrial X-ray film, which do require the same types of coating machines. I recently visited the Harman Technology factory, and the same machine coats multi-grade paper as coats Phoenix and Delta 3200. It's just a matter of tweaking inputs and, whatever else. So I guess they've just kept all their equipment around and running at some capacity, and now they're really ramping it back up to put it up to its maximum potential. Unlike someone like Fuji, who, if they don't use something for a week, probably destroy it to make sure no one else can ever do it. And as you'd expect, C200 is designed for development in the standard C41 color negative process, yielding negatives that have to be inverted either during scanning or printing to give your final positive images. Lastly, a quick look at the color charts that I'll speak about in more depth as we go through things. Immediately we can see what others have already reported. The film leans both cool and majorly magenta in the greys, with good overall saturation, especially in the reds, which are much stronger than the blues and greens, and decent to high overall contrast, but nothing too excessive. After almost a full month of delays thanks to the local Irish courier preventing me actually getting the film in good time before summer ended, once I got my hands on it, I loaded it up into the Leica M4-2, which was a gift from a viewer. Brian, you are an absolute saint. After I took those color chart shots, which I have more of, I took a couple of shots around my local area before making a day trip to Paris where I visited my friend Tom, and I took shots under a range of different conditions. Decently sunny to quite overcast and cloudy, to artificial light, to mixed lighting. So although it wasn't a super bright, amazing sunny day, I actually got to try it out under a good range of conditions. I shot nearly everything on this roll with the CB35mm f1.4 Nocton Classic, though I took a couple with the Solonon 18mm f5.6 as well, though I mostly use that later on within the loupe itself. I rated the film at EI 200, which is very important as you'll see later on, using the Reflx Lab light meter because the M4-2 doesn't have an inbuilt light meter. Full details are on screen now, but I developed the film using the Kodak FlexiColor 3-bath C41 kit in the CP Lift rotary processor, scanned it with my Fuji GFX 100S, and inverted with Negative Lab Pro. It's new film. More film from more manufacturers is always a good thing. Anything to diversify supply and dismantle Kodak's nigh monopoly on the photographic market. I have worked very closely with Harman Technology, and I know this comes up a lot when people discuss me as a content creator. But at the end of the day, I'm fully in support of Innovus work on the Orwo NC project, as well as Lucky with this Lucky C200 project. These 3 film lineages or lines represent the new modern generation of photographic film, and I am fully in support of them, and I am buying these films to support the projects as best I can. We live in a world where one bad day of unethical clickbait journalism can threaten the future of the photographic industry, thinking of recent events with Kodak. And that's not a good thing for any of us. So the fact that there's just anybody else making color negative film is great news. When you expose it well, this film can be a bit of a joy to scan, and it's quite nice to work with in post. It does always lean magenta, like I said. Unless you do some heavy editing, it's kind of always there, so you just have to accept that as part of the look, which is not to my personal taste, but it is what it is. You're going to see contextually very good highlight retention detail and surprisingly good shadow detail in spite of the high overall contrast of this film stock. Like, it's not an incredibly high contrast, but compared to many others it has quite healthy contrast, without shadows that completely just turn into mush, which I was quite impressed with. On a related but separate note, I was quite surprised by how fine the grain is. If you compare it to something like Kodak's Pro Image here with another color chart, you can see that yeah, Pro Image is a finer grain film, it's a 100 speed film, but if you compare Pro Image to Reflx 2 to Lucky C200, you can see that C200 holds up very well. I don't have a color chart for Wolfen's NC200, but just based on my own subjective opinion, having scanned a few rolls of that film in various formats, out of Reflx 2, NC200 and Lucky C200, C200 does win in the grain department, and like, yeah, it's no Pro 400H Vision 3 250D, but considering that we're effectively talking about lower grade, consumer grade films, especially considering the price of C200 that we'll come back to in a moment, I am very, very impressed by the grain, especially in the shadows. I'm also very impressed by how well this film handles artificial light and mixed lighting sources. When you have a mixture of daylight and artificial light, it holds up better than something like Pro Image, subjectively based on real-world shots, but also under straight artificial light, it almost has a kind of tungsten film look, especially when you consider that any film can have halation if you expose it to a bright enough light source. This almost looks like it was shot on Cinestill 800T or something like that. And this isn't a tungsten balanced film, but the color cast that it gets under artificial light looks a lot better than other films, many of which just go straight green in a kind of a not nice, kind of nasty way. So that's really impressive. And I put this last because we have absolutely zero indication as of the time of recording what the Western pricing for this film will be, but it's selling for, I believe, 59 renminbi in China, which is about €7 or $8, including development and scanning, which is dirt cheap. There's some people based on this who think that it's going to cost like €5, $5, $6 in the Western world. I think that's unrealistic. But if this could hit something like the €10 mark in Europe, that would be an absolute killer. But if you compare it to the other kind of new wave 2020s generation of films, Phoenix, the NC films, they're going to be €3 to €5 more if this can hit that kind of €10 benchmark, which would present significant value. That's just speculation on my part at this time, but there is at least precedent that in some parts of the world, this film is going to be dirt cheap. For all the talk about high saturation in the reds and good saturation in the blues, this film has really impure secondary colors. There is a ton of excess red in a lot of patches on the color charts, like your oranges, your pinks, your browns, and your yellows, and you can even see it in the table itself. The response in the purple patch is also really poor and worth noting because it kind of stands out as worse than all of the other bluish kind of patches on the chart. Based on existing sample images or stuff like Jason's review, some people have said this looks like drugstore film. And they're not entirely wrong. You know, a lot of the time, the colors just look off. And there's no obvious immediate reason. And it's not because there's a massive cast, but the hues of the mixed secondary colors are all just a little bit wonky and a little bit wrong. And it can collectively throw the whole image off. And, you know, if the price is right, I think that's a fair trade-off to a point. You know, films have a look to them. But, you know, I feel like if you were to try and correct this in post, it would be a disproportionate amount, or it would require a disproportionate amount of effort versus just buying a more expensive, higher quality film to begin with, if that makes sense. I'm a very vocal and open hater of shooting color negative film under overcast conditions. There are very few color neg films I think work well when the weather is cloudy, and this is not one of them. I'm not the only person to say this, but you really do need to shoot Lucky C200 under warm, not like golden hour, but on a good sunny day, and the natural warmth of that light balances out the cool tones and the magenta in the film in a way that looks much nicer than what you get on just a cloudy day, where it can just look muddy and flat. And then you have low contrast, which makes it look, and low saturation, which can make it look not monochromatic, but quite muted. But then those muted colors also look wrong if you have secondary colors in your scene, which you probably do. It's just not a film I would shoot on a cloudy day, personally, under pretty much any circumstances. Disappointingly, this film has quite poor exposure latitude, and notably quite poor overexposure latitude, which is rare for a color negative film. Looking at the color charts again, there's actually quite a lot to unpack here. When you overexpose this stuff, it goes much cooler and leans way more cyan green, instead going warmer and more magenta when you underexpose it. Even though the film has an anti-halation layer, like I said, you can still see halation in very bright areas, which is fine, even Portra 800 does that, but there's a distinct inverse correlation between sharpness and exposure with Lucky C200, with the halation actually costing you a fair bit of fine detail, really visible in the edges of the whiteboard frame here. One good thing I can say about the Latitude is that, like any negative film, the level of grain does reduce even further when you're overexposing it, especially in the shadows. I've seen shifts like this before, like when I did my ECN2 versus stills film comparison video, and you can see overall, like a contact sheet kind of comparison, there are shifts in many of these films, but usually only this severe after like 2 to 3 stops, not within a 1-stop range. And if you think, okay, I'm rating the film up 200, not 100, but the highlights are going to be more than a stop brighter than middle gray, which means your highlights are going to lean cooler and your shadows are going to lean warmer, which can make it really difficult to work with. Like I said, when you nail it, it can be a real joy to scan, but if you don't, it can be an absolute nightmare. Whenever I do these my first roll videos where I'm only talking about a single roll of film, I do like to add a bit more value by talking about some of my favorite shots from the roll. So let's have a look. This is my third favorite shot from the roll, and it's nothing too fancy in and of itself, but I really do like, and I did not notice this when I was taking the picture, the guy in the black jacket with the backpack down in the front at the bottom of the escalator in front of these two guys in front of me. And it just made for a nice contrast with the color of their skin and their hair, but you can see that sort of pinkish tint that I was talking about earlier. This is actually one of the specific shots that I had planned out for the trip. Not that it's anything amazing, it's just something that I personally wanted to do. Not so much the thing itself of the Mona Lisa, but the people looking at it and capturing it. And I'm fully aware of the irony that I was one of those people. I don't like to photograph touristy stuff itself because there's no value I can add there, but I can capture people enjoying it. The sort of borderline between people watching and street photography with this kind of thing, I quite like. And there was strongly mixed lighting in here with varied color temperatures and bulb types, so it's a good example of how the film holds up reasonably well, certainly very well considering its price bracket and weight class, so to speak, in terms of mixed lighting performance. And this random shot turned out to be my favorite shot from the roll. I always love photographing architecture around France, whether it's in the north, out in Brittany, or down in Toulouse in the south. But one of the problems is always just the negative space in the sky. But then I saw this canopy sticking out from one of the buildings, and I thought that would make the perfect counterpart. The really bright, muted pastel colors of the walls on the right-hand side, and then this dominant dark black thing. This also served as a bit of a dynamic range test, which you can see the film absolutely failed, in that there's no detail under the canopy, which I think is fair. Most films wouldn't capture much there. But just as a shot, this is balanced really nicely, both in terms of color and contrast, as well as shape, with hard corners all over the architecture, and then the smooth curve of that canopy. This was just a serendipitous kind of random shot that I took walking around, and I'm really, really happy with it. So those are my thoughts about my first roll of Lucky Color 200. This stuff is surprisingly good, all things considered. I mean, the fact that Lucky never left the thin film coating market really gave them a strong advantage here. They have existing technology and equipment that they can work with, but I really hope they don't rest on their laurels and just assume it's going to be fine because they have lab books to reference and this kind of thing. They really do have a lot of improvements to make with this film before the global launch, as well as, future products. There's a lot of scope for improvement here, but I think they've done a very, very good job, all things considered. We've got great contrast with fantastic retention of shadow detail and surprisingly fine grain, especially in the shadows, especially considering the price and the context, like I said, the weight class of this film. It holds up very well. The saturation is very nice and the primary colors are held up well, but there's just too much red in everything else, which throws off the color balance quite a lot. And then you have that magenta cast, which if you're going to have a cast, people would generally rather the film have a cool or warm white balance rather than a green or magenta tint. So that's something that could be worked on as well. If this can come in that mythical €10 price bracket that I've kind of come up with myself, I think it will absolutely kill in the Western market. For everyday point and shoot kind of stuff, or just for artistic purposes, it's not true to life and faithful in its color reproduction, but I think that's fine, especially at a low price point. If it's more expensive, if it's going to be like €15, I think it's not going to do so well in the Western market, especially when you consider the latitude is not great. I thought I might be able to improve this by pull processing it when I get more rolls down the line. but the fact that it doesn't tolerate overexposure that well really kind of disappointed me. On the flip side, I think it might do actually quite well for pushing, because you've got great retention of shadow detail. It goes warmer, and the color palette seems a bit more balanced if excessively saturated when you underexpose it. And the shadow detail and grain gives you a bit more scope for pushing potentially, maybe if only 1 or 2 stops. But that gives me hope for the development of a 400 or maybe an 800 speed emulsion down the line as well. Maybe. I'm thinking way too far ahead. I'm fully aware that the global launch hasn't even happened yet. But, you know, I can already hear people calling me out and saying that I've been way harsher with this film than I have been with Harman Phoenix 2. But there's an important distinction there in that Phoenix 2 is not supposed to look like a normal film. This film is implicitly being advertised as a reasonably true-to-life, natural-looking film. And there's this uncanny valley where the closer you get to being a good film, so to speak, the better you have to be for people not to just say, I'll just buy Color Plus instead, if that makes sense. And this film firmly sits in the uncanny valley where it's done amazing things. In so many ways, it is better than NC200 and all of the NC films, as well as Phoenix and Phoenix 2. But in a way that makes it worse, because for a lot of people, they're going to look at this and just say, I'll just buy Pro Image or Color Plus or whatever else. And that does leave them in a bit of a tricky spot, but I do think that this project is worth supporting like all of the others, and I think there is hope for the future. I mean, Lucky have already made some significant R&D improvements to their SHD 400 and recently came out with a new SHD 50. So I think there's, signs that they've got a good R&D team in the background, but that is all to be seen. As this film stands right now, if the price is right, I'll absolutely take it for my point and shoots and for screwing around with flash, and just make sure you get your exposure right and you can have some fun with it. Just don't keep your expectations super high. But that is all very, whether or not I can recommend this is very dependent on what the price turns out to be. I'd like to thank Reflx Lab again for giving me the opportunity to test this film out, and do again remember they're one of Lucky's official distributors, so when the global launch happens, do check out their website over at reflexlab.com. But that's all I have to say for this video, so stay safe, and bye-bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.